Now, if you're using Angular Universal, if you converted your Angular app to a Universal app, deploying the Angular app does not work as it did before anymore. Because before, in a standard Angular app, you could use any static website provider like AWS S3. Because in the end, you just had to deploy a couple of JavaScript files and an HTML file. You didn't need a hosting provider that was able to execute code on the server. But this changes if you have a universal app, because now with a universal app, you do have code that must be executed on a server. And therefore, you now do need a hosting provider that does support server-side code execution. Now, as I mentioned before, an Angular Universal app in the end is a Node.js app using the Express framework. And therefore, you can simply search for a Node.js hosting provider to find a broad variety of possible hosting providers you can use to deploy your application to. And it will then always be the official docs of a specific hosting provider you should go through to learn how to best use that hosting provider. Here in this section, I want to conclude this section by showing you how you can prepare this app for deployment and which files you would in general need to deploy to a hosting provider. And when it comes to preparing the app, it all starts with this build SSR command. You should run npm run build:/SSR in your project locally on your system. You don't need to run this command on that machine you want to deploy your app to. Instead, you need to run this command before you deploy your app locally on your system. This will then give you this dist folder, which contains both a browser and a server folder, nested in a folder that carries your project name. And it's in the end the dist folder that must be uploaded to the hosting provider you want to deploy your app to. So simply that dist folder as a whole, in conjunction with the package.json file and the angular.json file. The other files and folders are not required because they just contain the raw source code that was compiled and optimized when you ran the build SSR command. But package.json, angular.json, and dist, these three things should be put onto the machine which should host this website. So let's now imagine that these three files were deployed to such a server and we are now on that server. I am of course still on my local machine, but let's assume that this is now on a server that should host the website, on a machine that should host the website. You would then connect to that machine, and then you need to run npm install to install all the dependencies that are required by that project. So this command must be executed once before you can start serving the Angular application from the machine you deployed these files to. Once this command finished, you should run this serve SSR command to start serving the application. And this is now a process that must keep up and running as long as the application should be served. And now here it's served under this address. Of course, you could forward this and map this to a different domain if you would be using a real hosting provider. But again, the official docs of that hosting provider you chose will be the place to go to see how to host this application on that hosting provider. Here for this demo, I now visited this address and I can see and use my Angular application here. And now it is being served by my local machine, but in exactly the way you would serve it from a hosting provider's machine. And as you see, it's just a bunch of folders and files you have to deploy, and then you can serve this Angular Universal application. Welcome to a new module. In this course, we had a look at a lot of functionalities Angular 2 offers us, which allow us to create awesome single-page applications. Now, one functionality we haven't covered yet, and where I also want to give you a basic introduction to it at least, are animations. Angular 2 ships with its own animation system, which we can use to, for example, render the addition of items to a list or the conditional attaching or detaching of elements to the DOM. So all these things which are kind of hard to handle with normal CSS transitions or animations, because if you add something to the DOM which isn't there before, it's hard to handle this with a CSS transition style. Therefore, in this module, we'll have a look at the tools Angular 2 offers us to turn this application here, which isn't too awesome, but which has a list at least, well, to turn this into a nicer application where we play around with a couple of animations and see how the animation system in Angular 2 works. In this application you're seeing here, I get two buttons, Animate and Shrink, and they don't do anything. I'll come back to these buttons in a second. And then we got two lists, and I can add items to the list with the Add Button list or with the Add Item button here. I can add it to both lists actually. I do have twice the same list because I want to show different animations later on. Let's start with the two buttons up here and the basics of animations. As a side note, this project is of course attached to this lecture. So how do we start with that? How does the animation system in Angular 2 generally work? Well, if we have a look at the source code behind this template here, we see that here we get the two buttons and then we get this empty div. Now that's the div I want to animate and on which I want to show how animations in Angular 2 generally work. Angular 2 animations, which we use in a component since we want to use them in a template, are set up in the add component decorator. Here we have the animations array, and in that array we define the animations this template should be aware of. Animations are generally TypeScript code as we write it here in our TypeScript file, but it's very easy to understand how we manipulate certain styles of elements, since there we will use the same names as we use with normal CSS styles. But you'll see what I mean. So how does an Angular 2 animation look like? How is it defined? Each animation has a trigger. So we need to add trigger, and trigger needs to be imported from @Angular core. And I will split this over multiple lines because I will import a couple of other methods as well. With a trigger, which is a function, we tell Angular 2 that we want to define a certain name, which we can place in our DOM, in our template, which should then, if it is placed there, trigger a certain animation. So let's give it any name. I'll choose div state since I want to manipulate the state of this div element. This name is totally up to you. So that is the trigger. That alone won't do anything though. I want to attach some animations or something what this trigger shall do. So the second argument to the trigger function defines the animation this trigger should toggle. Now animation is of type animation metadata as you can see here, and this actually simply is an array. So we pass an array as the second argument. Now with that trigger set up, and even though I have no animation added yet, I can already go back to the template and add this trigger to this div. I do this by using squared brackets, like when using property binding, but then add, and now the name of the trigger, which would be div state. So this trigger configured here in the TypeScript code is now used here, and this attaches it to that div. Now we need to bind that to something because the animation I'm going to define in a second shouldn't run all the time. So here we need to kind of, bind the condition which then controls which part of that animation we're going to set up should run. I'm going to bind this to a simple property named state, which doesn't exist yet, which I'll create in my component, a normal property in that component, state, which I will set to normal initially. That is up to you. That could also be a number, whatever you like. That is totally unrelated to your animation or to the Angular 2 animations in general, but we will use this state property and the different values it can have in our trigger up here now. How does it work? Well, let's say we wanna define two states, normal, which it is set to by default, and then we wanna give it another state. Let's say highlighted. Let's say we want to have animation between two states, and that is important how Angular 2 animations work. You transition from state 1 to state 2. You work with states. You don't have to name the property which controls your state as I do, but it makes sense here since we're talking about different states of that animation. So we define such a new state in our animation array simply by passing state and importing that from @AngularCore2. That's also animation related method. Now, as I said, we will at least have two states here to have something to transition from and to. Side note, I will show you a different setup in one of the next videos. And then we set up each state. Now we give it a name, normal, and this state here of course should match the state down there, because I want to use a state I actually use in my template or in the TypeScript code. So I'll use normal here, and here let's say highlighted. Both names are up to you, just make sure that you actually use them, like I do here, and therefore then also in a template where I bind to state. So how should the normal state look like? That is the second argument of the state method. Here we pass a style object or a style method, also imported from @AngularCore. So that's yet another method, but in this method we now define the style of the state. So we pass a JavaScript object, and here it's almost like writing CSS code, but don't use any dashes, so no background color like this. So how do we want to set up state here? Well, actually I want to set the background color, and I can do this by enclosing it in single quotes, or alternatively by using the camel case syntax like this. So I'll choose the first syntax with the single quotes here, and then I set background color to red, let's say. This is my initial state, that the background color is red. I also want to give it, or want to transform it, to set translate x to 0, to have it at its default position and not move it anywhere to the left or right. So this is normal CSS styling here. Be aware that we don't see the div as of now though, because, well, it is normal div here, and it only has our state, and even though if we were in the normal state, we only set background color and the position, but not the width and height. So in the template, let's quickly go to that div and add a normal style, totally unrelated to Angular 2, and set the width to 100 pixels and the height to 100 pixels, so that we can see it. Back to the TypeScript code. We set our normal state. Now we want to do the same for the highlighted state. Here I also pass a JavaScript object, and if we highlight it, let's say we want to set the background color, now I'm deliberately using the other syntax, to blue. We also want to transform it and move it, and we want to move it 100 pixels to the right, let's say. This is the highlighted state. Now if I save this with ngserve running to see the application, if this reloads, we see the red rectangle or square here already. We see a square because we set width and height here, but the red color clearly stems from our normal state, which we set up here in the state property, which we bind to our div state, which again is the trigger we're setting up here as animation. So we don't have an animation yet, but an animation is always just a movement or a journey from one state to the other, and at least we're at the beginning state now. In the next video, we'll have a look at how we could get to highlighted and how we can animate the transition between the two states.